Conversion rate is the percentage of website visitors who take the desired action. And it's computed by dividing the number of visitors who took the action by the total number of visitors. So for the statistic I gave you earlier, it would be the 3 customers divided by the 100 visitors, or a 3% conversion rate. Now we want that conversion rate to be as high as possible. And that's why we have conversion rate optimization, because it increases the likelihood that website visitors will take the desired action. So we have 3 definitions. We have conversion, conversion rate, and conversion rate optimization. And that's all we need for this discussion. Let's talk about diagnosing the problem. Why aren't your website visitors taking the action that you want on your website? That's what we're going to address. You may be familiar already with a sales funnel. They've been around for many years, long before digital marketing, and you'll see variations of it. Some have more or less sections or labels, but what they do is describe the process that essentially all of us use when we're making a decision. We go through a mental process of going through these different stages, if you will, as we think through a decision. And so you need to remember that your visitor also will be using this decision process, this thinking process, while they are looking at your website. This is going to be happening. So let me show you how that plays out. All right, here's our sales funnel. Our first visitor has arrived. It comes in at the top and has never been on your website before, and takes one look at it and says, do I want to look at this website? Do I want to learn about this company? And some of them are going to say, yeah, I don't think so. And they leave right then, boom, gone. That's some of those 97 people. And you've probably done that yourself when you stumbled across some website that for whatever reason did not appeal to you. But hopefully most of the people say, oh yes, I do want to check out this website. However, at this point, we are now at the interest level. And this time the visitor is thinking through this process and is thinking, does this organization offer what I am looking for? And they are probably looking at your product pages or your service descriptions, whatever. And some of them are going to say, no, it really isn't what I'm looking for. And they will leave your website. That's some more of those 97 people. But because you've got such a great product or service, some of them are going to say yes. And you think, oh boy, I'm halfway through the funnel already. This is looking better and better. But here's a sticky part. And the sticky part is because you have lots of competitors, either alternatives or just the decision to not to do anything at all. And so some of them, you guessed it, will probably leave your website. But if you've made it through the decision stage, once again, you're tempted to declare success, but that would be premature. We don't get a conversion until they actually take the action. And some number of your visitors are going to say, no, I'm not going to do it now. I'll wait till after I get my paycheck, after the holidays, whatever reason they might have for not doing it right away. But finally, some people say, yes, I do want to do this. I like them. They had what I wanted. I'm going to take action now. And you've got your conversion and you can celebrate at that point. But what you can see from this simplified description here is that your visitor has to essentially say yes at every one of these transitions from one stage of his or her thinking to the next. It's a serial process, more or less. And this is what your visitor is going to be thinking about while he or she is looking at your website. And we're going to base all of our conversation today around this sequence of thinking. And this is how you get your conversion. So, okay, how are we going to diagnose your website's problem? It has to be persuasive enough to get the visitors to answer yes at every stage of that sales funnel, like we just looked at. Here's the hard part. You have to figure out at which stage the visitors are saying no and are leaving your website. What were they thinking about as they left? And I can hear you already thinking, how in the world am I supposed to know? I'm not going to know what they were thinking. I'm not a mind reader. But luckily, there are a lot of sources of information that will help you figure out where is it in the thinking process that this person is leaving. Here are some of the places you can find information to do that. First of all is Google Analytics. They are outstanding at this. They have an entire section of reports that are focused totally on analyzing conversions. You might see things in there like a very, very high bounce rate for your homepage. That probably means that your problem area is at the awareness stage. That's why they're leaving. You might see that the time they spend on your product pages is like 2 seconds. And you think, that's a clue that I'm losing them at the interest level. So it gives you a lot of clues, shall we say, as to where the trouble spot might be. There are other analytics packages as well. You might have one of them, especially if you have an e-commerce site, and it might have information that also contributes to this diagnosis. And that will say things like, did people have things in their shopping cart, but they left before they actually did checkout? And that would say, a clue, they got all the way down to the action stage and then they left. That would be something you could check out. Observable activities are things that are not necessarily on your website, but can contribute ideas for where the problem is. For example, did they subscribe to your newsletter? You would be able to see that. Did they call for their free consultation? Are there things that are observable that contribute to your analysis of where is the trouble spot? Or you can guess. That was really supposed to say educated guess. If it's an educated guess, it would be things like, what do you know about that's happening in your industry right now? Maybe all your competitors are busy running holiday discount sales. You aren't. That might be a contributor to why all of a sudden you're having a lot of trouble at the decision level, the decision part of this sales funnel. Certainly, you could just truly guess without any data at all. Some of you are going to be tempted to not do the analysis part, but that would be a mistake. And let me tell you why. If you say, I really want to strengthen action. I want to make sure if anybody comes to my website, they can't possibly decide to leave. They'll be so impressed with my CRO at the action stage that they'll for sure give me a conversion. Well, that would be fine. You work hard, looks good, you did a great job. The only trouble was your real difficulty, your real problem area might have been at awareness. If that happened to be true, then it means nobody would ever make it all the way to the bottom of the funnel to see all the great stuff you did at action, because you haven't yet fixed the problem up at awareness. So that's why it's pretty important, if you want to get the best benefit from the effort you're going to put into this, if you really know where the top priorities might be at this time. So let's go on and say, okay, you've done due diligence, you've analyzed, you think you know where your major problem area, where people are leaving, at what point in their thinking. Let me be careful here. This is people thinking. At what thought process are they leaving your website? All right, we're going to fix it. We're at least going to try to. I will tell you right this minute, you're going to recognize every CRO tip and trick that I'm going to show you, and not a single one of them is a silver bullet. So I'll just tell you that right now. But they all work. CRO tips and tricks are things you can do on your website that increase the persuasiveness of your website. And the I'm getting messages on my screen. I'm sorry, I got distracted with messages. We need to increase the persuasiveness of your website by implementing these tips and tricks where they will do you the most good. Now, there are a lot of them to choose from because they become extremely popular. They're everywhere. And so instead of giving you that long a list, I have selected a couple for each of the stages of the funnel. Some of the tips are actually things that will be successful or helpful, at least at any stage, or at least most stages. But others are a little more specific. And so I've given you a selection to get you started as you're going to go and work on your website. Let's start at the awareness stage. Let's say that that's where you've decided your big problem area is, and that's the one you're going to go after first. First impressions matter here. Remember, this is the visitor who took one look at your website and within microseconds said, nah, not for me, and left. And so we really need to strengthen that first impression to address this part of the exodus of some of the people from your website. Here's the first one. Apparently, all of us are extremely impatient. And studies have shown that if it takes more than 2 or 3 seconds for a web page to load, people don't stick around to wait for it. They just leave, boom, gone. And so it's really important if you want people to look at your website that all of your web pages load very quickly, both on mobile and on desktop. So that's the first thing you should go out and check. Check all your pages. Second, page appearance. Not much of a surprise, but again, we're very impatient and people want to be able to immediately understand what is your page about. Remember, they've just finished looking at probably all your competitors' websites, so there's a lot of comparison going on here. And so you want to make sure it looks good. One of the things that might come as a surprise to you is that those photo carousels, that's where the pictures, sort of scroll across the top, those do not test very well. So they are not recommended from a CRO standpoint. But one of the things that does attract your eye, attract attention here, is an image of a human face. We're sort of programmed to zero in on human faces. I have some bad examples of human faces. The example on the left is just kind of a weird composition as the children are sort of peering out through the text there. And the one on the right doesn't have any face at all. So these are sort of bad things, but you probably aren't doing those. But these are things you should also be on the lookout for, things to avoid. The example on the left is too busy, and the one on the right is perhaps not busy enough. Remember, I said people want to be able to instantly know what your webpage is about. And here, it's about food, but you don't exactly know what about food. So that's not ideal the way these are set up. But I also want to call your attention to the navigation on each of these. Look at the one on the left. Where do you think you're supposed to click for the next step? Is it on the menu that's over on the left-hand side? Is it in those blue circles along the bottom? Is it on the image of the gift card? We don't really know what we're supposed to do next. And the one on the right, the first thing you have to do is find the navigation. It's not up at the top. Those are just little cupcake symbols. The navigation, one of them is in minuscule print down the bottom left where you're not looking for it at all. And then you see the little tiny horizontal lines at the far left. That, I guess, is your best chance at finding a menu. The reason I go on and on about navigation is because it's the third thing that is part of the first impression as you're trying to improve your awareness success, your awareness persuasiveness on your website. One of the things that is recommended as a best practice is if you have one of those navigation bars across the top, don't have more than 7 items, because that's about all people can comprehend or remember. And they will remember best the ones that are the first and the last items in that list. So it's recommended that you put your most important button, whatever it is, or navigation tab, at the far right. You'll often see contact over there. Once again, another surprise. Those pull down menus, which absolutely everybody uses, they're not recommended. And you will see a trend that is head towards using alternatives, one of them being the text links that are right in line in the text. But we don't want to lose track of what is the main goal here we're trying to do as we do CRO. We are trying to inspire the visitor to transition through this funnel. And the thing that comes after awareness is interest. So that's where we're headed. That's where we want the visitor to head. So let's assume that our visitor is looking for a Pilates instructor. And so our visitor looks at the menu here on the top, home, services, about, and contact. And that tells her absolutely nothing at all about the company. It could apply to any of 1,000 companies. They all have the same one. What if instead she sees the next one down, home, yoga, Pilates, nutrition appointments, and she says, oh, yes, I want Pilates. There it is. Oh, and this is probably how I make up appointments. So here she is. She's already talked herself into the transition to the next stage of the sales funnel. She's already moved into interest. and she didn't have to click on a thing. So as a consequence, it is recommended that you use descriptive labels on whatever kind of menu items that you're using, and build your navigation around your most important pages, not just the one that everybody else has used or your website developer knows how to do. You want to think this through. It is important. It's part of your first impression, and it gets you into the next transition stage, which is where we're going. We are going now to interest. This is where the person will be looking at your product pages, your service pages, possibly some of your experience or things like that. And we want them to think good things about you. How might you make it more persuasive? Your website should answer 3 questions. First one is, what customer problem do you solve? The next one is, why should they choose you? And the third one is, how do you address their worries? So your website should answer these in its content. Companies are tempted to jump straight to question 2. Why should they choose you? But that's a mistake. Do not ignore the very first one, which is, what customer problem do you solve? I know it's sort of counterintuitive, but your website should focus on the visitor, not on you. It's about them. It's not about you. And that's a theme that you're going to hear throughout this presentation. And as I say, it's counterintuitive, but keep it in mind as we go and look at some more of them. So let's assume that our visitor, this is an example about a bottled water delivery service here. And let's assume our visitor looks at this and says, oh my goodness, yes, that's exactly how I feel. I hate having those empty water bottles scattered all over the house and overflowing from our recycle bin. I really want to buy something and get rid of this problem and get it out of my life. Well, that visitor has just talked herself or himself into working all the way down to the bottom of our funnel. They've already motivated themselves to see it through to an action stage. It's exactly what we want to have happen. So this can be a very persuasive and helpful portion of adding to the content of your website. I have some examples also of the other 2 questions. Now, almost every company does a good job on why choose us. They put a lot of effort into that one. But I picked this particular example because I thought it was sort of an eye-catching format. The same thing is true in my selection of the example for how do they address worries. Now, these wedding planners know that new brides or upcoming brides have plenty of worries. They're very, very nervous and stressed out. And so rather than depend on just sort of a dry FAQ page, they have hit it straight on their homepage with addressing their worries and having a lot of reassurance there. Things like warranties or experience and other things actually answer both of these questions. Why choose us? Well, because they offer a warranty. Do I have to worry? Nope, they've got a warranty, I'm covered. So there are some things like that which actually answer several of the questions without requiring a lot of verbiage. So our first thing was you should answer those 3 questions. We're still in the interest stage, however, and look at this one. I told you the theme is it should be about them, not about you. And look at this example. We want customer-focused headlines. That's the CRO approach. And when you first look at this example, you think it is customer-focused, maybe. It says that the jobs come to them and that the application is already approved. And so it sounds sort of customer-focused, but look at the headline. This headline is not about the visitor. This headline is about the company. Our company needs truck drivers ASAP. It's not about the visitor. It's all about them. So compare that to the improved version. Here's the improved version. And now the headline is definitely addressing the visitor. Get more money. It's more or less what it's saying. Better pay. Also the inclusion of a smiling human face is certainly an improvement over the 2 decapitated bodies that were in the other one. And you may not be able to tell very much from this slide, but the survey or the application form is actually a little bit shorter on this one, and that's going to be better. But look at the headline, the difference between the 2 headlines. One's about the company, one's about the visitor. Make sure that all of yours are about the visitor, or at least many of them are about the visitor. Here is some of the test results about why short forms are better or how much better they are. If you can get by with just a couple lines. Go for it. All right, so we're in interest. And one of the things that makes people more interested and is more persuasive is if they get to know you better. You're not just a name, you're actually a personality. And that's frequently done with things like newsletters or things that they can download. They learn more about you, they learn more about the topic that's of interest to them. So these things are very common because they are successful. People like them. But you can also get a lot more creative. This one example is a quiz. You'll see a number of things like that. But I think the masterpiece of creativity to engage the visitor was done a number of years ago when Apple first came out with the really spectacular camera on their iPhone. Do you remember that? It might have been iPhone 7, I'm not sure. And what they did was they asked all the people who had bought them to take pictures with their new cameras and send them to Apple. And Apple picked the best ones and used them in all their advertisements on magazines and billboards, everything. Wildly successful campaign. So that was sort of the gold standard for engaging visitors. I don't know that you're going to do that, but it is good. They will like you better if they're engaged. However, there's a warning here. In your zeal to impress your visitors, be careful that you don't inadvertently trigger analysis paralysis. Some people get really uptight when they have to make a decision. They find it either frustrating or stressful, and they may actually leave just because they're uncomfortable on your site because of that. So there's an example here that more is not necessarily better. 24 choices of jam, people still only bought 2, the same as with 6, and a whole lot more people did it. They were happier. So if you do offer a lot of things, if your business does cover a lot of topics, make sure that you have organized it well and put it into manageable chunks that don't upset them. Excuse me. All right. This is not helping. I apologize. Okay, I got all excited about decisions. We made it halfway down our funnel. We get all excited when you see visitors that have made it that far and really like your product or service. But it's tough when you get to decision because there are alternatives, both direct competitors and just the alternative not doing anything at all. Now, we already, back in interest in the previous section, we already told the customer why they should choose us. So what else are you going to do when they get the decision? Well, we're going to have your happy customers tell the visitor why they should choose you. These are very, very powerful. They're one of the most persuasive things in all of CRO because people read them and in general believe them. Now, if you don't already have social proof on your website, I would encourage you to rush right out and get some because it's really that good and people are starting to expect it actually. But you don't have to depend just on reviews and testimonials. You can also use things like partial client lists, any awards or commendations that you might have gotten, customer success stories, which are longer testimonials. All these are examples of social proof that can be very useful to you. But because we are in the decision stage, at some point, your visitor is going to start thinking about money. How much is this going to cost me? So even if you don't publicize the dollar amount on your website, you may not publish it there. You may require them to contact you to get it. You should be thinking about how you might experiment with the pricing that you do for your product or service. There are many different options. You've seen them as you've been on the internet yourself, and you can sort of see which one works best for your target audience or which one competes best with your competition. And as I say, there are a lot of them to choose from, both in terms of well, there's just a lot of them. You know them. I don't need to reiterate them to you. But I did want to point out tiered pricing because it's one example of what's called price anchoring. So let's talk about that just a little bit. It shows the power of using more than one number. If you saw the example on the left and saw only $29.99 for the Blink Mini, You might think that sounds pretty expensive for such a little thing. However, when you see it next to the $64.99, your brain has already anchored on the $64.99. And by comparison, $29.99 sounds like an absolute bargain. And so psychologically, you're much more prepared to pay once you've seen the two numbers shown together. That's why this kind of markdown is so persuasive. The example on the right is similar, but not quite the same. Here, your mind is sort of focused or anchored on the $1. And so you get all excited about the $1, and your brain doesn't really pay as much attention to the $34.95, which is in the fine print down at the bottom. So using two numbers together, whether it be tiered pricing or in something like this with markdowns, can be very persuasive as you explore pricing options. The last thing is sometimes even with appropriate pricing, shall we say, it's just going to take a little extra to push your visitor over the edge to pick you. We're still in the decision stage, and it might require that you consider offering something extra. In this example, the person is going to get a free lithium battery, something of value, something probably wants. Sounds like a good deal. It doesn't have to be limited to just physical objects. Our Pilates teacher, for example, could give away a free nutritional analysis if you sign up for Pilates classes. So there again, you can offer something extra, very persuasive as well, and sometimes is much more effective than just a dollar discount. So under the decision, we've already said ourselves why they should choose us. Then they have social proof where everybody else says they should buy you or choose you. And then this little extra incentive above your excellent pricing to do something extra. We're down to the action stage. And you think, oh, this should be easy now. I've gone through all the hard part. I've gotten past the competition. You know, they like what I've got. This should be a slam dunk. Unfortunately, that is not true. There are many people who abandon their shopping carts, even though they got all the way down here for a variety of reasons. And so once you've got them on your website in your hot little hand, so to speak, you want to get them to take the conversion, to do that action before they leave. You may never get another chance at them. And so there's this real sense of it's now or never kind of attitude. And as a consequence, CRO sort of goes into high gear when it gets to the action stage. You all know this one, call to action buttons. And these can be useful at any stage of the funnel, but you almost always see them at the action stage. In terms of best practices, bold colors attract more attention, particularly red buttons. Including the word yes increases the probability that people will click on them. And just the alternative to that is they'll think twice before they click on a button that says, no, I don't want to save more money. So having two buttons together can also really add a persuasiveness that wouldn't be there if it were all by itself. So I have some examples of these, which I really like. These are some of my favorite examples. The company on the left has a green logo. And so their marketing department thought it'd be really great if they had matching green buttons. But they had read the research about how red buttons got more attention. So they did a test with green buttons and the exact same thing with red buttons. And you guessed it, the red buttons got more clicks. So I guess they went with the red buttons. But look at the one on the right, the example on the right. These two buttons are absolutely identical with the exception of one word. In the first one, it says start your free trial. And the other one, it starts my free trial. And the second one got almost twice as many clicks. Do you know why? Shall I give you a hint? Your website is supposed to be about them, not about you. And so the wording on the second one makes the visitor feel that he or she is in charge. Yeah, I've decided I will start my free trial, which comes across psychologically or in the, what's the word? Anyway, subconsciously, that's the word I'm looking for. Subconsciously, they feel in charge, as opposed to start your free trial, which is a command from the company. Maybe that's how they think about it. And so the second one got a much better review. It's also probably why, including the word yes, look at how that one's phrased. Yes, let's take the first step. I, the visitor, have decided I would like to take the first step with you. And so it's actually the same psychology on both. And I don't know how many people actually do that. as they're designing their call to action buttons. So I thought I'd make sure that you really noticed that one. Okay, now your two favorite, I am certain. I told you, once you have somebody on your website, companies really want to get the conversion pinned down before they leave. So they create a sense of urgency. There are two of them together, you know them both, scarcity of supply and scarcity of time. And the whole idea is that people are afraid of the fear of missing out, is what it's called. And you know this one for sure on scarcity of supply. Only 2 seats left at this price on the airplane. Only 2 widgets left in stock. Only 2 openings left in our daycare center. You see it all the time. And here's its companion, scarcity of time. And the really one who fine-tuned this, I think, is Ticketmaster. Have you ever tried to get concert tickets on Ticketmaster? When we were doing it, we had 7 minutes to do it. And we watched the seconds tick down from 6 minutes and 32 seconds. And we're looking for our seats, we're grabbing for our credit card. There is definitely a time limit. There are others that are a little more forgiving, like limited time only or 3-day sale, things like that. But there are infinite variety of these things. And you too can use them to create a sense of urgency in your customers. So scarcity of supply and scarcity of time. We've now gone through all 4 of the phases and how to make each one more persuasive for our visitor and to help suck them through, if you will, through the thinking process and get them down to the bottom. But we haven't yet talked about the actual conversion process itself. So let's do that. Whatever version you use, whether you have shopping carts or a physical phone call, calendar sign up through some sort of plugin on your website, whatever it is, it should be very streamlined. It should be fast. It should be easy. It should be foolproof. Absolutely, they cannot possibly make a mistake. And obvious how to start the process. You'd be amazed at how often that isn't true, that they don't actually know. And what phone call was I supposed to make? What was the phone number again? You know, it has to be really obvious how to get started and then foolproof once you do. The little square on the right has reasons why shoppers abandon carts, but the same concerns happen also if it's not an electronic shopping cart. Unexpected costs, people don't like that. They don't like to always have to make an account. They don't want it to be complicated, and they want to know how much exactly is it going to cost me. So those, although in this particular graphic that I found is referring to shopping carts, it also applies to almost any other process. And so I would like you to assess, what is it that you're expecting visitors to do? Don't let down your guard at the end. You want it to be really streamlined and happy for the customer. Now, I have some examples of conversion for you. Look at this one. This is a B2B software example. And that green button there is their call to action button to start their process for the conversion. But it's surrounded by other CRO elements. So they're offering something extra, it's easy sign up, and they've put all the social proof summaries here. They have both partial customer lists, they have ratings. So just while it's in your eyesight, just while your fingers hovering over that button, they're reminding you of all these reasons why you want to click that button. Look at Booking.com. Once again, we find that they have all sorts of CRO right here in front of you. They've got offering something extra with a breakfast, scarcity of supply, of course, how could it not have that one? Reducing worries, you can cancel any time, social proof, got plenty of that. So Booking.com is not shy at all about using those CRO techniques. And we're all used to looking at them. You shouldn't be shy either, especially if you follow the example of Amazon. Now, if Amazon, they know everything there is about selling. I couldn't think of a better example. But it wasn't until I actually made this chart that I realized to what extent they are using all these things that we're talking about. Look, one right after another. There's essentially nothing except the product price that isn't a CRO element. And so I would like to encourage you to liberally, shall I say, use all these CRO things that apply to your business. I would start with start small, but build up to this. I have left you a quick reference list. So when you do start this on your own later, you can have these to refer to. If you go back to the recording, you will see them. And let's just put it together. What you're going to be doing is identifying the biggest product problem area by analyzing the visitor actions. And you're going to use those different sources of information I was telling you about and pick the one that seems to be the worst and start there. Then you're going to select appropriate CRO tips and tricks that you can use to make that portion of the visitor's thought process more persuasive. Then you can celebrate your success. And hopefully you'll be so inspired by the fact that your conversion rate has gone up a little bit that you will repeat this cycle and do it with yet another phase of the funnel. And I wish you well with your efforts. I'd love to know how many of those 97 people you're able to turn into customers. Thank you so much. And I think I'm supposed to answer questions now.
Yes, Margaret, thanks a lot for the presentation. And this has been extremely helpful. And we have a few questions. So the first one, you actually answered during the session, but you may have a little bit more. They asked, what if I have 10 services? How can I use descriptive words for my header bar?
Well, without knowing what the 10 are, I can't really say, but I think that you'll probably do groupings. And so you see it at like a huge department store, and you'll have men's clothing, women's clothing, sports clothing, whatever. So they put them in bigger chunks. And then you're going to say, well, yes, but don't I do a pull down menu after that? Hopefully not. What you can do is when you get them to a general, let's assume you have made categories something less than 7, that once they click on that, then they will have the additional buttons to push or links to go to get to something else. So you should be able to break it down and organize it in some useful way. But don't just call it services.
So the next question is, it appears that the service if a service is high priced, is it better to list that on the website? So I think the question here is, if the perception is that it might be expensive, should you list it on the website? And I think, you know, you also touched on this before, maybe do some comparative things. You know, it may look like it costs a lot, but you can do stuff to make it seem like it's not as much. But what are your thoughts on that, Margaret?
To some extent, it depends on what your business is and what everyone else does. Certainly, if I'm buying furniture, I expect to see that it's $300 for the end table or whatever. And so I'm expecting to see a number, and it may or may not appear expensive to me. If it's something else, however, where they're not expecting to see a number, see what all the competitors are doing, see what the alternatives are doing. If I know there's a jewelry store in town which has very expensive jewelry, they always say, call for quote. And if it's a variable amount, it always says, call for your free quote or click here for your free quote. Certainly having the comparison pricing or saying to compare against would definitely, if you're going to put the number there, put it there. The other thing is a big question as to whether you should list your expensive products first or your inexpensive products first. Most of the time, the choice is to, either one can work. Let me put it that way. Either one can work. So if you start out with a $1 million diamond bracelet or whatever, then when you get to the $200 emerald solitaire, it looks good. That's one of those anchoring things where you started with the expensive product. On the other hand, it might be that you want to start them on the lower end product and work them up so that you can get them to say yes to something. And then it's only it's only $27 more for the, you know, whatever, and you get twice as much. And you'll see that's what you find in tiered pricing. They always start with a low end and say, but you can take guests. If you just pay a little more, you can get 5 people into the museum instead of only 2. So you can, it works either way, depending on your product and your industry as to what you do with the comparison pricing.
So the next question here is, it says, I'm curious, is there a statistic to show how many times a buyer visits a website to check the product before they buy?
I did not look up that statistic. I'm guessing it varies a great deal by product. I mean, if I know I want to buy a particular book, I go once to Amazon and I buy it. But if I'm looking for that end table, I probably go 15 times before I finally make a decision. So I don't know that but I'm sure you can find a statistic, but I would have to do it by industry or by product.
And an actual follow on there is, does the conversion rate, metric take into account 2+ visits from the same person?
Some of the analytics packages do that. In fact, there are some very complicated conversion rate formulas that, what if they come, the mathematics, I only gave you 3 definitions and I gave you the simple mathematics for that conversion rate, but there are whole articles talking about different factors you should put into the math to answer exactly that question so that you take it into account. There's a whole lot written on that.
Another question is, can we get a copy of this presentation with the recording?
No, we only do the recording. We don't actually hand out slides. Was that the question?
I believe so, and thank you. So here's another question. Where should social proof be located on the website? A separate page or the home page or somewhere else? And I know you talked about it being on the call to action page, but where are the best places to put social proof?
Well, it depends on where you think you need it. It's one of those things that helps almost anywhere. And so whether you have it scattered throughout, you'll find that as an example. You'll find it a whole page dedicated to it, but then if somebody misses that page, then you've lost it. And so we've lost that opportunity. So I think that sprinkling it around is certainly possible. People are used to seeing it. It's okay.
Okay. So put it pretty much wherever you can, I think is what you're saying.
No, it has to make sense. It has to make sense. If you're busy talking about your first service, you've got somebody raving about your first service. If you then have 2 or 3 more services, there's nothing wrong with having them, also talk about that one.
Yeah. Okay. So we had a couple questions about Google Analytics and being replaced by G4. And so one of the questions is, will that be automatic? And is there some place to get training or information on G4?
Okay, first of all, it's not automatic. You have to install it also. And it is very, very different from Universal. And so, yes, training will be required. You can't just automatically know it by magic. It's definitely not automatic. However, because it's been out now for a while, there are many, many articles on the internet and YouTube videos, including a lot of them generated by Google themselves. They've discovered that people are having difficulty with the transition, and they've made some efforts to plug that hole. They strongly recommend that you run both in parallel for a while, so you get used to what used to be here, what do they call it there, how does it look different there. So all those resources are available, but it does take effort, and you do have to install it a second time.
So here's another question is, are there any statistics to show if a money back guarantee makes a difference in the success rate for conversion?
In general, I would say it does. It's listed as one of the things that you offer as reducing worries, but no, I can't just quote the statistic for you.
Okay. So this question was, I sell health products and they have several health benefits. Should I just pick one health benefit that most people buy for and only advertise that on the homepage?
That's one of those things that would be good to be able to test it with it and without it. We don't want to distract people from the main bestseller, shall we say, but you also hate to walk away from the table, leaving some money on the table. It would sort of depend on how similar they are, as in, do they both appeal to the same market? Upselling is a really common thing, for example. So maybe you sell, I don't know, dishes, to eat food off of, and then you try to upsell tablecloths. I'm making this up. I haven't planned this particular example, but to upsell is very common, where you put something that's related and for the same customer base, but aren't the same. I don't know if that's your situation. If they're 2 wildly different things, that could be more difficult if the customer base is not the same for both of them.
So here's a question on sort of target market. What if we only want the right clients / target market signing up? What do you recommend we pay attention to or include? I do talk about the right client. There's 7 different points on that in my website, which is in the process of being built. So how would you, if you want to have exclusivity in terms of your clients, how would you present that, I guess is the question.
I think it's back where you were saying answering the 3 questions, which were, what customer problem do you solve? Why should they choose you? And worries. I think I would put it there, because when you talk about what problem do they solve, you see it in financial, I have no idea what yours is, but you see it for financial organizations. If you are a high income individual and love the luxury of the penthouse suite, then we're the hotel for you. That's not very well worded, but they make it clear we're an expensive hotel and we only want people who can pay for it. So they try to work it in somewhere. So depending on what your service is, if you describe the problem that you're solving, and then why should they join you or pick you, it's along those lines where you could try to be vaguely subtle, but still specific. Now, again, since I don't know your exact example, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think that that's probably where I would try to capture it.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is, can you share more about why photo carousels are bad for the homepage?
Yes. What has been in some of the literature is that it distracts people. Remember, we don't want them to stay in the awareness stage. We want them to go to the interest stage, and they get involved in watching these pictures go by. And then they've cycled through once and they're on reruns, and the person says, oh, show's over, and they click and they leave. And they never actually stopped it at the one that is whatever it was they're interested in. Let's say tents and camping gear and fishing rods and stuff all went by. They sort of watch all the pictures. They forgot that they actually came here to look at tents, and they're gone. So it distracts people, apparently.
Interesting. I hadn't thought about that. In this one, we offer private one-on-one service like massage. How do I create scarcity on my website for the clients?
Well, I didn't actually promise you that you could use every single one of those CRO for every single business, but let's talk about it anyway. One-on-one for scarcity. It can be things like, we only have 2 Saturday appointments left, or something along those lines, if you felt that was appropriate. I'm in a room where the light keeps going on and off automatically. I apologize if that's a distraction to you. Scarcity for one-on-one service. I'm not quite clear why you want to have scarcity, or is that just to inspire them to sign up? Because it might be, if it's just to inspire them to sign up, you would do better with a special that is going to expire after 36 hours, or we only have a 3-day special for the price. And so create the scarcity with a time scarcity rather than a supply scarcity. Maybe that is more appropriate for the example you're trying to describe.
As a follow-on, the same person was saying, we are actually in the process of building our website right now. Would you be able to take a look and give us some feedback on that?
I am a regular certified SCORE mentor, which means that yes, you can get on the SCORE website and request me as a mentor, just like anyone else can. And so if that is of use to you, I would be glad to participate under the normal SCORE process.
Okay, now the last question that we have here is, how do you handle minimum advertised pricing? In other words, pricing required by a dealer arrangement when the competitors don't abide by the agreement. For example, the manufacturer won't allow you to advertise products for less than $100, but your competitor is advertising for $80.
I don't know that that's really in the category of CRO. It sounds like maybe you should write to the manufacturer, but if that's not an option, then I would go for offering something extra. I told you that every once in a while, having something extra is more effective than having a dollar discount. So depending on whatever the context is here, if, first of all, can you afford it? But maybe even something that doesn't cost physical money, you can give that would counterbalance the fact that the other one is a lower dollar price.
You know, what comes to mind on that for me is that in some places, they won't give you the price unless you put it in the shopping cart. And I think that might be something like that, where they have a minimum price that they have to abide by, but if you're actually buying, then you can do a deal. But like you said, I would say, go ask the manufacturer what their policy is on that. So let's see, the A/B testing. When I read about CRO, they always talk about A/B testing, but you didn't mention that. Why not?
All right, actually, I showed you 2 examples of it. Do you remember the company with the green logo and the red buttons test? That was an A/B test. A/B testing just means you have 2 exactly the same websites with only one difference, and you run both of them in parallel and see what one does better. The problem is, to be statistically significant, you need a very large volume, and not many small companies have enough volume to do a really good A/B test in a reasonable amount of time. And so normally when I'm doing score conversations, we don't deal with companies which have, thousands of visitors on your website. And I congratulate you if you do, in which case, by all means, there are many packages out there that successfully do A/B testing. It's very powerful, but you got to have a lot of visitors to make it work.
Well, thanks a lot, Margaret. This has been extremely helpful. And let's see, if you got the upcoming webinars, we have 2: Taking the Mystery Out of Business Insurance on January 26th, and Basic Product and Service Sales Skills on February 21st. So make sure you look out for those emails advertising those. And as Margaret said a little earlier, if you want to request a mentor, please go to our website. If you have a smartphone, you can sort of put it up to the screen here and take a look at the QR code. But the idea is to satisfy the needs of our clients. We are best doing this in one-on-one sessions. And so Margaret can help you with that. And there are other mentors that can help you with things like sales and marketing expertise. So thanks again, Margaret. This has been extremely valuable for our clients here. And I will bid everyone good evening. And thanks a lot. We're having several people thanking us as we head out. So we'll end right now and see you in the next session.
Thank you, John.